All right, guys, we are going to wrap up our chapter on the spinal cord. And so all we have left to talk about is reflexes and a few different types of reflexes and how they work. So let's get started. All right, so by definition, a reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus. All right, and these reflexes do not typically involve the brain, although the information will be sent to the brain eventually. For the reflex to occur, you do not need to involve the brain in that process. All right, so with reflexes, we refer to a reflex arc. All right, so that's kind of the pattern or the pathway that information takes. Okay, and so you can have spinal reflexes, which are going to travel through the spinal cord. All right, so most of our examples are going to be spinal reflexes. And then you can have cranial reflexes, which travel through the brain, and we'll have one example of that. All right. And so with a reflex arc, let's talk about what the general components are of a reflex arc. And so then as we go through each type of reflex, we can point out specifically these components for that reflex. All right. So a reflex is going to be initiated by a receptor. All right, so these receptors detect some sort of change, whether it's stretch or contraction of a muscle, whether it's pain or temperature or light, it's going to detect some sort of change. All right, so there'll be some sort of receptor. In this kind of general example here, all right, we have a receptor in the skin for pain. And so if you prick the skin with a needle, that receptor would be activated. That information is then going to travel through a sensory neuron, which is going to move afferent, so towards that spinal cord. All right, you would then have your cell body for that sensory neuron in the DRG, the dorsal root ganglion. All right, and then that sensory neuron is going to synapse in the spinal cord. All right, and so here, where it synapses, we refer to this as the integration center. All right, so this is the integration center. Oops. And so that's where the sensory neuron synapses. Okay. And so I want to point out something here while we're talking about the integration center. Synapses. There we go. So reflexes can be monosynaptic or polysynaptic, and that all refers to this integration center. So if that sensory neuron, all right, synapses onto a neuron that then synapses onto our motor neuron, that is going to be a polysynaptic reflex. All right, so we would say there is an integration neuron involved. Okay, so there's an integration neuron. All right, so this green neuron in our picture up here would be an integration neuron. However, in some synapses or some reflexes, they're much simpler. So this sensory neuron would just directly itself synapse onto the motor neuron. That would be a monosynaptic reflex. All right, so sensory synapses onto motor. Okay, there's no integration neuron in between the sensory and the motor. So that's monosynaptic versus polysynaptic reflexes. And so we'll point out those as we go through our specific types of reflexes. All right, and so that all depends on what that integration center kind of looks like in the spinal cord. Okay, and so then from there, from that integration center, whether it's monosynaptic or polysynaptic, the information is passed on to a motor neuron. All right, so that motor neuron is going to leave the spinal cord, so it's efferent, and it's going to travel to what's called the effector. And so the effector in this case, in the picture we have here, is going to be a skeletal muscle, right? So it would cause contraction, or depending on the neuron, it could cause relaxation by inhibiting that muscle. All right, so effectors could be muscles, and oftentimes they are. All right, they could be smooth or skeletal muscles. They could also be glands, and so we'll talk about that. Okay. All right. So that's our general reflex arc. So we have some sort of receptor that is stimulated by some sort of change, sends that information through a sensory neuron. All right. That synapse from the sensory neuron occurs in the integration center. Information is passed to the motor neuron, and that motor neuron goes to the effector, which typically is muscle. There are also some scenarios where we'll see glands involved. Okay, so then we have a couple more terms to define down here before we go into our specific reflexes. All right, so the first one is ipsilateral. So if you have a reflex that is ipsilateral, this just means that the receptor and the effector are on the same side. All right, so receptor and effector are on the same side. Okay, so this reflex we're looking at here would be ipsilateral. All right. If you have a reflex that is bilateral, all right, you'll have a receptor that is stimulated on one side, and it affects both sides of the body. All right, so affects both sides. And then lastly, with contralateral, you're going to be affecting the opposite side, and we do have one example of that. All right, so this would affect, meaning the effector is on the opposite side of the body as the receptor is on opposite side. Okay. All right. And so reflexes can be somatic, meaning they're going to involve skeletal muscle. All right. Or they can be autonomic, all right? And so an autonomic reflex would be a reflex that involves smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, all right? And it can also involve glands. Okay, so if this reflex that we're talking about involves skeletal muscle, it's going to be a somatic reflex. And if it involves smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland, it's going to be an autonomic reflex. All right, so that's our terminology to kind of get us set up. So let's talk about our specific examples and types of reflexes and how they work. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is called the stretch reflex. Okay, and so this stretch reflex occurs in response to stretch. Okay, and so what I want you to think is it's a protective reflex. And so what happens is if a muscle, like your quadriceps muscle here, is being stretched too much, it will trigger this reflex that will shorten the muscle to kind of protect it from tearing. Okay, so the stretch reflex's function is to prevent overstretching of the muscle. Okay, and so the receptor involved is a muscle spindle. So a muscle spindle is just a specialized smooth muscle cell you can see here. All right, and it's kind of wrapped in nerve endings that detect how much that muscle is being stretched. So all of our muscles contain these muscle spindles. So they're in all muscles. So technically you can do this stretch reflex on all muscles, although some it's much easier to demonstrate than others. All right, and so the easiest one, typically the one you see at like a doctor's office, would be here, right, where you hit the knee and see, the leg extend. All right, So this is called the patellar reflex. All right. So the patellar reflex is a specific example of a stretch reflex. Okay. And so because we are looking at skeletal muscle, right, is where the receptor is. Skeletal muscle is also where the effector is. So this is a somatic reflex. All right. So the stretch reflex is somatic. All right, so let's talk about our components. Okay, so we had our receptor, all right? That's our first component. The receptor is the muscle spindle. All right, that receptor is going to send information through that sensory neuron, going afferent through the DRG, where the cell body is located, dorsal root ganglion. And then it is going to synapse onto the motor neuron in that ventral horn. All right. And so you can see it is synapsing directly onto that motor neuron. There's no integration neuron in between. So that means this is a monosynaptic reflex. All right. And so then that motor neuron is going to leave efferent through the ventral root. And it is going to travel out to the muscle. Okay. And so with the stretch reflex, the effector muscle, it is ipsilateral, and in fact, it is typically that muscle that the muscle spindle was located in. All right, so it causes contraction, right, of the stretched muscle. All right, because remember, contraction always shortens a muscle. So if the muscle is being stretched too much, you would want to contract it to make it shorter so it doesn't tear. All right. Okay, and so with our patellar reflex, the way it works is, remember, you have your quadriceps muscle here, all right, and they're connected to the tibia by this tendon. All right, and that tendon contains the patella right here. All right, so what you can do, and what the doctor does, is he'll have you sit with your leg kind of dangling over the edge of a table. All right, and he'll hit the tendon right here. Okay, and that will cause that tendon to kind of bend inward, and that will pull on this muscle, kind of pull it forward, causing it to be stretched. That sudden kind of unexpected stretch is what triggers this reflex. Okay, so you're stretching out this quadriceps muscle by hitting the tendon. Okay, good. So that's our stretch reflex. All right, so our next type of reflex is called a Golgi tendon reflex. So the Golgi tendon reflex is kind of the opposite of the stretch reflex. So the stretch reflex prevents muscles from stretching too much, and the Golgi tendon is going to prevent muscles from over contracting. All right, so a lot of times you'll see this, like if you ever watch bodybuilders trying to pick up like more weight than they can really handle, all of a sudden their arms will just give out and they'll just drop it, right? Whether they don't have any control over that, right? That's just a reflex because the muscles are over contracting. Okay. So this does involve skeletal muscle, so it's going to be a somatic reflex. All right, and the receptor for this reflex is called the Golgi tendon organ. Okay, so the Golgi tendon organ is located, as the name kind of tells you, in the tendons, and it just detects contraction of the muscle, all right, by, kind of pulling on that tendon. Okay, so it's going to detect contraction. When that contraction is detected, so that's what we have here with this blue, right? So this blue is the sensory neuron associated with those receptors. All right, those receptors are going to be activated by the muscle contracting. All right, that information will be sent towards the spinal cord, just like before, afferent to our DRG. Whoops. There we go. Into the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord you can see here that we have our integration neurons, meaning this is polysynaptic. All right, so this is a polysynaptic reflex. All right, those integration neurons will then connect to motor neurons, which go out to the effector, or in this case, the effectors. All right, so there's two that we're looking at here. Okay, so this one would be traveling to the muscle that was contracting. All right, and it's going to inhibit the contracting muscle. Okay. There's also going to be a message sent to the muscle that acts as an antagonist to this muscle. So here, if we're talking about like our quadriceps muscle here, a signal would also be sent to our hamstrings, right, on the back of the leg, telling them to contract. All right. So we're going to cause contraction, right, of we'll say antagonist muscle. Oops. All right, and so that's because we want to counteract that contraction, right? Make sure it stops. We want to kind of stretch out this quadriceps muscle that was overly contracted. So we'll do that by causing contraction in the opposing muscle, okay? So this would be causing extension of the knee, all right? And activating this muscle will now bring the knee back and cause flexion of the knee, okay? All right, so this effector is skeletal muscle. Okay, so those are kind of our opposing reflexes. So our stretch reflex and our Golgi tendon reflex, one for stretch, one for contraction. All right, so now let's talk about the withdrawal reflex. All right, and so the name kind of tells you with the withdrawal reflex, it's a response to pain, right? And so it causes you to withdraw from some sort of painful stimulus. Okay, and so if you're withdrawing your arm or something like that, that is going to be skeletal muscle, all right? So this is going to be somatic. Okay, and so the receptor for this reflex is called a nociceptor. And so a nociceptor is a pain receptor. Okay, so in our example here in this picture, all right, we have somebody reaching out with their hand, touching a really hot, cast iron skillet. That hot temperature and the burning is going to activate these nociceptors, and that information will be sent through that afferent sensory neuron, all right, to the DRG. And then you can see there's a series of interneurons here, right? So that means we are looking at a polysynaptic reflex. All right, that information is going to be transferred to the motor neuron or motor neurons, right? Will kind of coordinate the movement between the muscles. And that will cause you to withdraw that affected limb. All right, and so this is ipsilateral. And so you want to withdraw the limb or the whatever body part was hurt, right? So we pull away from the painful stimulus. All right, so another example would be if you step on something, like if you have kids and there's Legos on the floor or something and you step on a Lego, that you would automatically pick your foot up because it hurts, right? And so you would be withdrawing that foot from the Lego, right? So it's ipsilateral. So it affects the same side where the stimulus was. Okay, and so paired with this withdrawal reflex is typically going to be a reflex that's called a crossed extensor reflex. Okay, and so it works kind of in conjunction with that withdrawal reflex. However, it's contralateral. Okay, and so think of this as kind of a counterbalance, especially if we're talking about, the stepping on a Lego example. All right, to counterbalance that withdrawal reflex, if you suddenly pick up your left foot because you stepped on a Lego, you definitely want your right foot to kind of extend and take the weight And so that's the job of this crossed extensor reflex. All right, so it helps you to kind of maintain balance when that withdrawal reflex is activated. Okay, and we're not going to really talk about this whole pathway. It looks, obviously, you can see it's very complicated. Just understand that it works with the withdrawal reflex, and it is contralateral to that painful stimulus. All right. Okay. All right, so then we have another kind of interesting reflex called the Babinski sign, all right, or the plantar reflex. You don't have to know the actual reflex arc for this reflex, just understand why it's important. And so it's performed by kind of swiping. Usually the doctor will use kind of the metal end of their reflex hammer, right, and swipe it along the lateral side of the foot. And so a normal response to this would be that your toes curl, all right? However, if you see the toes fan out, kind of like we're seeing here, all right, with this baby, that is called a positive Babinski sign, all right? So in adults, that would indicate some sort of brain or spinal cord damage. However, in infants, this is actually a normal response. And that's because in infants, their neurons, all right, are still forming and they're not yet myelinated. All right, so you'll get an abnormal sign for this reflex. Okay. All right, so a positive Babinski sign in an adult is abnormal. All right, so this is abnormal for adults. All right, and then a normal response where the toes curled is called a negative Babinski sign. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about an example of an autonomic reflex. All right, so this will be our last one. Autonomic, again, it means it involves, instead of skeletal muscle, we're looking at smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. All right, so some examples of those would be urination, right? So it's called the micturition reflex that causes urination, all right? Defecation reflex, salivation in response to a smell or the sight of food, all right? That would be acting on glands, all right? These other two would involve typically our smooth muscle. And then we have our specific example we're going to talk about called the pupillary reflex. Okay, so this is the reflex of your eyes to light, right? And you know that the diameter of your pupils change when they're exposed to light. Okay, so this is a reflex that involves obviously your eyes, your retina, all right, but it also involves the effector, which is smooth muscle that controls the size of your pupil, making this an autonomic reflex. All right, so let's talk about the components. So the receptor for this reflex is called a photoreceptor. All right, photoreceptors detect light. All right, so obviously we have photoreceptors in our eyes, right, our retinas of our eyes. So they're going to detect that light, and they're going to send that information. So we're looking here at the red ones. All right, so they're going to take information from the retina detecting light to the brain. Okay, and they're going to travel through the optic nerve. All right, let me highlight some of these things that are really important, right? So they're going to travel through the optic nerve. That's our sensory information. You can see it happens on both sides. All right, that is going to travel back to the brain. It crosses through the, which is not labeled here, optic chiasma. All right, that's where those fibers cross over, or some of the fibers cross over. All right, so you can see fibers from the medial eye cross over to the other side, and the same with this one. And the lateral eye, stay on the same side. And so we have in this now optic tract a mixture of sensory fibers from both eyes. Okay, and those are going to travel back to posterior parts of the brain. You don't need to worry about their names. All right, back here where it's integrated, and so our integration center would be back here. Definitely a polysynaptic type of reflex. And then that motor neuron would start here. Okay, so this is our motor neuron. All right. And so also this is pointing out another important thing, that this is a cranial reflex, right? Previously we only saw spinal reflexes. This is a cranial reflex because it's traveling through the brain instead of the spinal cord. Okay, and so this signal is now sent through this motor neuron back to the eye, all right, through cranial nerve number 3, and it goes to the smooth muscle that controls the size of the pupil, all right, and it'll be sent to both eyes because this is a bilateral reflex. I think that's, nope, I haven't written it anywhere yet. All right, oh, there it is. All right, so this is a bilateral reflex, constricts both pupils, okay? And so the muscle, all right, that it's acting on is called the constrictor pupillae muscle, okay? And it kind of encircles the pupil of the eye, all right? When it's activated, it'll cause the eye to constrict, right? So if you're shining a lot of light on the eye, that pupil is going to become smaller to kind of reduce the amount of light getting into the eye. All right, so this is bilateral. If you shine the light on the left eye, you should see this response in both eyes, okay? Because remember, this information from your left eye is being sent, and it joins information from your right eye, and so they're both processed, and that response goes out to both eyes, okay? So it should be bilateral, and that's one thing when in a hospital setting they're testing your pupillary reflex, they're making sure, that's one thing they're checking, is that it is bilateral, that response, okay, and that there actually is a response to that light. All right, so that's our last reflex, and that's the end of the spinal cord chapter. All right, and so then next we are going to talk about the autonomic nervous system.